Does the panel have any additional questions on this portion of the presentation? Right. So, Alex, I'm looking at you as a chair. Would you like to take a break now or ahead of schedule, or would you like to go into the panel and presenter question and answer period?
So we're about 45 minutes ahead of schedule right now?
That's correct.
Are you all wanting a break now? Would you like to roll into questions?
Doesn't matter.
I think we should roll into questions now.
Okay, we're going to go into the panel and presenter question and answer period. So the panel, I'm going to turn it over to Alex to sort of facilitate the questions from the panel to the presenters. And this is on sort of any questions that you have about the presentations that have been received, the reading material that you guys have been doing to answer the questions in your charge. And this is really the opportunity for you, panel, to ask any questions that you might have that would help facilitate you in developing your initial recommendations. You guys know the drill. So just a reminder to the public, if you would like to make public comment at the end of the day, please fill out a blue slip that are located on the table in the back and hand them to me anytime during this discussion. So, Alex, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. I don't want to put any one of us on the spot, but if folks have any initial questions they want to start with, just sort of keep it loose.
And Alex, just a reminder, speak pretty closely to the mic so folks can hear you. Thank you.
Maybe I'll just start with one. One of the things that's maybe just too much into the weeds in terms of salmon ecology, but just wondering about sort of the characterization of those three major genetic stocks as sort of their life history type. I mean, we're discovering more and more that that's not fixed. In other words, the life history structure of spring run fish has a strong potential component, at least in a lot of other regions, of ocean type fish, and which has been argued to be a resilience factor for the population. Do you examine that, or do you look in to see what BDCP conservation efforts might do to expand that variability in the life history structure?
We don't explicitly examine that in terms of how the proportions may change over time in response to something. Because of BDCP, let's say yellow bypass favoring a fry rearing strategy. Really, it's just discussed in terms of here there is more opportunity for expression of a different life history, but there isn't an attempt to kind of quantify how it might change over time. But that's definitely a valid comment.
I guess you just might think about at least commenting on it. That something like yellow bypass is a great example of where you have the potential in high flow years to potentially contribute to the resilience by that expansion.
Right. Yeah, we do have in the winter run Chinook salmon section, we do have a sort of VSP kind of categorization of different attributes and how they might relate to VSP parameters. And so that's kind of related to that, but not to the specific level that you're interested in.
So related to that, and refresh my memory a little bit on yellow bypass, in the fish that would utilize that habitat, has it been broken down into sub-yearling and yearling?
And the way we've examined it in the analysis, and I showed this a little bit this morning, was in terms of smaller fish getting the growth benefits with that fry growth analysis, larger fish getting the benefit of a higher survival migration route primarily. And there is some overlap there. In the Central Valley, a smaller proportion are yearling fish. A relatively small proportion are yearling fish. Most are sub-yearling fish as they come into the delta, young of the year.
So I have some questions about lower trophic levels. And I noticed a real effort to look more at microcystis, for instance, in terms of contaminants. I thought that was much more broadly sort of looked at in this iteration. But I have some questions about sort of lower trophic levels in general and this idea of producing more production acres or primary production acres, because microcystis is a piece of that as you're expanding this shallow water habitat in combination, as you say, of increasing water residence time and likely water temperature. I didn't see a whole lot in terms of discussion about community composition shifts, except saying microcystis may expand. We may expand some area, and I think that should give folks pause. But the flip side of that is if you're improving microcystis habitat, that's at the expense of other beneficial phytoplankton. Mm-hmm. And so I was wondering if you could sort of point me in the direction of where that discussion happens.
I guess our general conclusion is that, at least from the perspective of things like changed nutrient balance, that BDCP wouldn't be expected to change very much, and so that's been the focus of our analysis. I think what you're hinting at is potential for biological interactions, for example, with microcystis, and that's something that we could explore more, to be frank. Mm-hmm. So that's a point well taken.
I guess to follow up on that, though, the nutrient question in terms of changes to the nutrient field with respect to BDCP, one of the considerations we have is you expand wetland habitat, you are potentially producing a sink for some nutrients or transformations of nutrients, which should lead to alterations in things like nitrogen form or N to P ratio. And again, I'm not sure to the extent that was handled, but please let me know if I'm maybe not looking in the right place. I understand the point that the BDCP activities directly don't introduce new sources of nutrients, but certainly will alter processing within the plan area.
Yeah, there is some general discussion in Appendix 5E, Habitat Restoration Appendix, but I don't think to the specific level that you're thinking of in that regard.
You discussed earlier that the fisheries agencies contributed and discussed the net effect tables, but I was wondering, do the agencies agree with all the summaries? Because at the end of each fish species, you have an overall, level of effect, level of certainty. Are all agencies agreeing with those conclusions in all species? If not, which ones they're not agreeing with?
I don't really want to speak for them. They were provided prior to the release of the public draft. I think that it's acknowledged that we'll continue to work on them, so I don't really want to speak to what extent. I'm not going to answer for the agencies as far as whether or not they agree with every single conclusion. I don't think we haven't even had that conversation with them, but I think it's at a point that they felt that it was at least okay for the public to begin their review of the analysis while we continue towards our final plan and analysis.
And they're not willing to provide that information to the committee?
I don't know if you guys would like to come up and answer that. I think there's at least National Marine Fisheries Service and Fish and Wildlife Services here.
So
David Swank with National Marine Fisheries Service. I was part of those.
Can you say that to the microphone?
Oh, sorry. I'm David Swank with National Marine Fisheries Service. I was part of those discussions on the net effects. I think Marion characterized them pretty well. They were very useful. They weren't, quite rigid, formal scoring that maybe you had in mind. I would say we certainly don't agree with every score that they came up with. I'm sure you're not surprised when, even among biologists, the fish biologists in the room, we didn't necessarily agree on every score amongst ourselves either. I would say that our major area of disagreement is just on the basic importance scores for some of the species related to flow, which really shouldn't surprise panel members, I wouldn't think. I mean, that's been sort of the ongoing areas of disagreement we've had in BDCP for some time. So. And we do have comments on those that we have provided. I don't know if we've decided to give those to the panel or not.
Yeah, so the fish agencies, your memos were part of the supplemental reading material? Those are the ones you're talking about? Remind me of the date.
I'm not sure if they were included in that or not, to be honest.
Okay, I'll check on that, but I believe they are. I'll get back to you if they're not.
So then just a word from the Fish and Wildlife Service. I think the most recent documents we've added to the process you have, it's called the Progress Assessment. I think that was dated April of last year. Should be in your packet. I would suggest, I don't think any formal determination of any kind has been reached, and the reason we're having the discussions we're having today is because we're not sure yet. So we'd like your opinion on those things.
I think it'd be, just so you know, those were provided last April, and so we have been, we've had those for quite some time, and we were working towards addressing each of those comments that were in the progress report memos into the public draft. And so we don't have a formal then assessment from the agencies about similar to that level of detail on what you're reviewing now.
So I have a question. In the plan you have some quantitative biological objectives, which I think are great because it guides you towards monitoring and adaptive management. And one that I'm thinking of is the through delta survival rates for each salmonid species. So an improvement in survival. So I'm just wondering, because we're not tasked with evaluating and the monitoring and adaptive management, but is there a plan to monitor through delta survival each year for each species? And then at what point within adaptive management do you take that into consideration and have decision points on if they're achieving or not achieving those goals, what you might do to help the fish achieve those survival rates?
So in many of the biological objectives, including the ones you mentioned, we do have milestones described within them. So for the through delta survival objectives, we have specific survival portions that we intend to achieve by a certain year. So we will be tracking progress on through delta survival for all of the runs, at least on an annual basis, and assessing progress towards each of those milestones as we go. We don't have any hard or fast rules built into the plan. So, for example, if we come close to meeting a through delta survival by year, I've forgotten what the deadlines are, but let's say it's 2040, but we're not there yet by 2040, does that mean we failed? Well, maybe not, depending on the conditions at the time, and perhaps other factors maybe out of the control of BDCP. So those are all, that's information that feeds into the adaptive management process and would inform whether or not we make a change and shift, whether it's project operations or where and how we do habitat restoration. And we have a lot of knobs that we can turn on the conservation strategy to adjust the course of the ship, if you will, to meet those targets. So I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Yeah, but there is a formal plan to monitor survival of each species.
Absolutely, and in fact, as part of every one of the conservation measures, there's a monitoring element to it. And one of the appendices in Chapter 3 describes all of the monitoring that would occur and links it to each of the biological objectives. So while it's not a blueprint to be able to go out in the field and conduct the monitoring, those protocols will come later. We think it's at least a suitable framework to develop those field monitoring protocols to assess our progress toward each of those objectives.
I might just follow up. One thing to take a look at, in looking at there, I was trying to figure out exactly that question, is where is that monitoring? And it almost appears that it's under the research category, not under effectiveness monitoring. And so I guess one thing is, in my mind, that should be elevated to effectiveness monitoring. It should be, an explicit part of the program, not necessarily at the whims of research priorities.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe I'll follow up another on that same sort of line is in Appendix 3G, which is talking about the survival aspects and have those quantitative survival estimates, which again I agree with Greg are a good step. It sort of mentioned that the efforts to restore the salmon habitat and improve overall ecosystem productivity will be considered as measures contributing to recovery, but have separate objectives not considered here. And I was sort of trying to find where there were in fact going to be survival estimates that were either assumed or built in, or would be, the product of early monitoring that would actually address the survival benefits of habitat, as well as some of the the migratory, especially diversion to the central delta issues. Something basically scaled up yellow bypass sort of monitoring that should evaluate what the benefit of those, especially shallow water intertidal restoration sites, are going to contribute.
Yeah, we definitely agree and recognize that a robust and consistent monitoring program across all of the tidal natural community restoration sites is going to be really important to judge their success, not just in effects on fish survival, but even more basic as, are we producing the food, the types of food, the amounts, is it going to be in the places where the fish can access them? All of those key questions we need to be monitoring for those restoration projects.
If related to yellow bypass, if that proves to be quite beneficial for the salmonids, is there a way to maybe divert more fish into the bypass without diverting more water?
I've heard it at least suggested, maybe speculated, you could explore, for example, non-physical barriers, just as it's been looked at Georgiana Slough. That might be a little speculative for the main stem Sacramento River up there, but it's certainly something that could be considered in some fashion, recognizing that diversity is important of different life history strategies.
I would just add, I think there's any disagreement about what people are seeing from the studies that have continued to come out about the benefits of the bypass relative to salmon survival and growth. And our analysis is pretty conservative. We assume just a certain volume of fish per flow entering the bypass. And so, I would argue that that's one measure or piece of the BDCP that really is get that built, get it done, and then start figuring out exactly how you get more fish on it, because I don't think there's a question that the fish that use it are going to be better off. It's just not something we're able to analyze right now as part of the effects analysis with the tools we have. And I think even if we did, we'd want to be careful about being too rosy about the benefits. I think right now the analysis is, trying to be balanced and conservative about the benefits there, but certainly implementation is where that's going to really shine, I think.
We do also have other constraints, as I'm sure you're aware of, this tension between wanting to flood the bypass lots more and for longer, and deeper, but there's active farming there. This is an area that people rely on for economic income. So we have to balance that as well, and that will be also part of the additional work that the Bureau and others are doing to study optimizing really the flooding regime and the bypass to minimize impacts on ongoing agriculture as well.
I was curious about the tidal marsh restorations. I'm very pleased with the scale at which you're planning to do restoration, and I'm wondering how central it is to some of your other biological objectives, mostly because you talk about the fact there might not be sufficient suspended sediment to actually restore all of the tidal wetlands in all of the opportunity areas, and that the pumping would remove 8 to 9% of the total suspended sediment, which would also then have a huge impact in the San Francisco Bay for salt marshes being able to keep up with sea level rise. So what would you end up with if you didn't get tidal marsh restoration? What kind of habitat, and what would be the positives and negatives of that for the covered organisms?
I'll start, but then I want Martin to answer regarding the modeled reduction in sediment, and I think, David, you should talk about the reusable tunnel material that would be available for use. So I think, what we have, and it was mentioned in part of the modeling presentation today, is a hypothetical footprint. And so what we were able to model and quantify was the net change in sediment removal from the delta based on the changes in the point of diversion. And so that's where I think it's 7 to 9% reduction in sediment load into the delta. And we did find that for those species dependent on turbidity, like the smelts, to be a low negative effect. So our net effects captures that as a low negative effect. But I think we were really careful to be clear that the actual habitat condition within the restored sites and within the sites that are current habitat will really depend on those specific sites and the design of that restoration over time. And so I think it's difficult to translate that quantitative assessment of sediment, change in sediment loading, to a biological condition, although we try to be conservative in calling it a low negative effect, recognizing that there's likely to be less sediment entering the delta, except for David's description of the reusable tunnel max. So I don't know if Maren wants to add anything to that regarding the biological side and that modeling.
I don't really have too much. I mean, obviously things like habitat suitability for, let's say, phytoplankton or prod acres analysis, obviously that would be somewhat less of a benefit depending on the extent of there being less shallow water habitat. But it would really depend, I think, on the specifics of that.
In terms of the sediment, this is actually something we're actively working on, is to better define how the reusable tunnel material would actually be reused. That's likely to be a very large source of sediment to increase the flexibility of where tidal marsh restoration could occur. Right now, the hypothetical footprint does not assume any fill would be needed to create a marsh plain. And of course, that limits where we would be able to do it because so much of the delta is subsided. So by diverting, and it's over 20 million cubic yards of material, there's a lot of material we'd be pulling out of the tunnels. We know as well now, thanks to testing that the DWR engineers have done, that there's a very large proportion of that is likely to be usable as fill for wetland restoration projects or levee stability. We also know from the work that the San Francisco PUC has been doing on their tunnel project, the majority of the material they've been using has been used on Bear Island and restoration in actual tidal marsh projects in San Francisco Bay. So that's very encouraging. We also know that the sediment taking, once the intakes are operational, they'll be removing sediment from the river, as you say. That's another source of material that could be and really should be put back into the system, so there isn't a deficit beneath the intakes. There's also other dredging that occurs in the delta in various places, and that material is not being put necessarily to the highest and best use in our opinion. So we're actually actively assessing all of these different sediment sources to see when those sources would be available, how much is available, try and link it as best we can to when tidal restoration would occur to give us that additional flexibility in restoration. So certainly our ultimate goal is to put back into the system as much of the material as we're taking out, and of course the reusable tunnel material itself is not material that would have been in the system, so we can supplement it with that as well.
So one of the things that was mentioned just a minute ago, or I think it was Jennifer's presentation, was that there's probably going to be about 10 years to come up with the initial operation guidelines for the North Delta facilities. My thought is, you've done a lot of work on the BDCP, and in your own mind, you probably have a lot of ideas that are the initial guidelines that you would suggest as how it should be operated. And, a lot of time and money has gone into this process, and I'm wondering if there are plans for you to put that in the BDCP or a supplemental document of your suggestions of what those would look like to help, so that you aren't starting with ground zero, that you start with what knowledge you already have and what criteria you already think that should be implemented in that. Have you thought about that at all?
I would think this has been a really rewarding project for our team. I think I speak for the hundreds of people that work on it, because I do think that we have been provided the opportunity to really, as experts, provide that feedback back into the project. So I think as it's currently described, it's already captured a lot of that. As far as initial operations go, there's a whole set of criteria that are applied to the operations. It's really only the fall and spring that are still, to be determined and decided upon for initial operations. So it's not as if, the criteria for the North Delta intakes isn't, that's a set criteria right now. So I think that we've been providing that input to DWR and the agencies all along, and there have been several adjustments made. The new proposed project is very different than the old proposed project that was originally provided as the first admin draft or the preliminary admin draft. So I think, we are staying on top of those ideas, and we often ask ourselves, would we do something different? We're looking at these results, and what are we seeing for these species, and what would we do different? And I can certainly speak for the fish team that we are constantly asking ourselves that question, and what should we be doing differently, and continuing through that process. So I don't know if on the terrestrial side, if that's a similar kind of approach, but I think we've been trying to make those adjustments as we go.
Yeah, I would just add, and hopefully it was somewhat obvious this morning, a lot of the things that we've included in the effects analysis are suggestions to help the agencies with their decisions about permitting and so on, and in particular things like differences between level 1, level 2, level 3 North Delta intakes. It may have seemed like, oh man, still talking about this, but really just to illustrate that there has been a lot of kind of give and take as far as trying to provide useful information. So hopefully that all comes together in terms of determining the initial operations. I don't know. I was thought you were asking Jennifer what she thought there. You don't want to do that.
I would add, too, that one of the things to consider as you're reviewing this is that there are constraints. There's regulatory constraints related to, the ESA that we're trying to comply with. There's constraints around, what the CVP and State Water Project can do. And so, we're trying to help along the process within those constraints in the same way that, all the agencies involved are having to face those various, boundaries from wherever they're coming from. So just wanted to make sure that was out there as part of my response.
Another question. Did the evaluation attempt to take into account differences in the behavior of wild versus hatchery origin salmonids? For example, spring Chinook, the report characterizes the wild origin fish being more of the foraging type sub-yearlings passing through the delta, whereas the hatchery fish are characterized as migrants.
Yeah, qualitatively, I would of course add to some of our descriptions in the appendices to the effects analysis. A lot of the information is derived from hatchery origin fish, just because those are readily available in large numbers for things like acoustic tagging studies. So while we are hoping that the results for hatchery fish are at least somewhat representative of wild fish, at least in terms of relative differences, we do acknowledge that inevitably there's uncertainty with hatchery origin fish. Things like timing and those sorts of things, we do try and take into account if there are timing differences in terms of the wild origin versus hatchery origin fish. So, for example, yellow bypass fry growth tries to take into account the period of when wild origin fish are coming in rather than Coleman hatchery influenced fish, for example.
Yeah. And so related to that, and going back to the biological objectives of survival through the delta, was that metric for migrant salmonids or for forage sub-yearling type migrants? And the difference is that it's the sub-yearlings that would benefit more from the habitat restoration, which is a major part of the plan.
It's really meant to capture all individuals. However, and I'll look to the National Marine Fisheries Service, all juveniles are included in the biological goals and objectives as far as the targets for juvenile survival, but I think it's acknowledged that the best estimates that generally exist at the moment are from acoustically tagged hatchery origin larger individuals. So, it is recognized that there's some difficulty there as far as through survival, and it's hoped that those sorts of things can be refined as the technology improves and we can learn more information about smaller size fish.
I would add, too, that even though it may have been difficult to track between migrant and foragers, they are scored differently and they're weighted differently for each run. And so relative to the restoration attribute in the net effects, you're going to get a more important score for the forager, so that will reflect in the weighted total score of a particular species and based on the timing of when they're coming through the delta. So we did try to capture their experience and with how they're actually using those restored sites, and not just across the board score that the same across all users, since we recognize some are going to not use it much and some are going to spend their time and really benefit, hopefully, from that.
It is interesting, and I can't find it right now, but somewhere I found sort of the basic assumption that the shorter time they spend in the delta, quote unquote, the higher the mortality. And I think in the case of the foragers, that's not necessarily a good assumption, at least based on the other literature. So again, it would be sort of important to draw some distinctions, and potentially sort of functional distinctions to survival responses amongst those two generic groups.
Yeah, we do try and we added, for example, the particle tracking model nonlinear regression analysis. It rolls off the tongue. Was added in response to the idea that the Delta Passage model is perhaps representing the larger migrants that are going through, but some representation of smaller migrants, actually kind of fry-sized migrants, was necessary. And so, yeah, the point's well taken that even within, let's say, one life stage, there's different components to that could be affected in different ways. Restoration benefits for some, flow effects from others.
Well, maybe I'll do a follow-up. I think a lot of us struggle a little bit with sort of the basis of our charge being settled first and foremost in Chapter 5. And the reason is because in sort of trying to dissect and discover the science, we actually discovered that a lot of the detail is in the other chapters and the appendices. And I guess I would say, personally, after our experience, you should sort of revisit the thought that Chapter 5 could really benefit from a lot of cross-referencing to pages and sources for the detailed data that's there. Because I think when we dug, we found exactly what we were looking for, and we found it quite satisfactorily. But so I guess this comment right here is sort of where do we find XXXX? And so in this case, I'm trying to figure out for the restoration strategies is how do you select and prioritize restoration proposals? First of all, what's the process? What's the operational process of sorting through the pile of alternative proposals? Who does that? And then more so, what are the metrics or what are the criteria? It's not just area, level of subsidence. What are all the factors that sort of predicate its trajectory or the rate and the duration it's going to take to get to what's a desirable state? What's going to end up in, what's the colonization rate of what kind of vegetation? What's the connectivity? You talk a lot about connectivity, but what is that? Is that edge to natural uplands? Is it availability of adjacent upland that with transgressive sea level rise is going to turn into wetland? What and how would you rank those to make your decision? I understand, for a variety of reasons, you can't sort of lay out what those sites specifically are, but what do you use to decide on them? I guess if it's there, just tell me where to find it.
So a lot of that is outlined in Conservation Measure 4 in Chapter 3. We also have general restoration guidelines that are described in Conservation Measure 3 just before it. So those are the two places where you would find that.
Conservation Measure 3 has a whole section on connectivity, and it actually has a map that points out critical connections that have been identified.
One of the big issues that we came up with when we reviewed this before was just the level of uncertainty that all of these measures have. And it seems like a lot of that uncertainty has been pushed into the adaptive management context, and that if things don't go the way we had planned, we can adjust, rearrange, reprioritize. And I'm just wondering what the constraints will be on that adaptive management process as it goes forward. For instance, there's very specific targets about the amount of habitat that will be restored of different types. If it's decided that those aren't sufficient, or maybe you need to change that proportion, can those targets be changed? And secondly, there's very specific boundaries on the ROAs that have been put on the maps. If it's decided in the future that actually restoration may be more beneficial in a different region, can those be changed, or are we locked into that once this is signed?
So I'll start, and maybe others can chime in. In terms of the restoration opportunity areas, the ROAs, those are defined more as a guideline. So we are, and we can point you to that later about where the plan does explicitly allow tidal wetland restoration certainly to occur outside of those ROAs. But those are the areas in which we're likely to focus the tidal wetland restoration. In terms of amounts of restoration or protection, for that matter, those are also flexible. For the tidal wetland restoration, though, in particular, as I think we do describe in Appendix 3A, which was our sort of history of the conservation strategy and how it was developed, the analysis that has been done identified that number as close to really the maximum that could actually be feasible, based on a lot of factors such as subsidence, the availability of land, proportion of public versus privately owned land. So it's hard to imagine that number going up, but certainly it could be shifted in space. And if we find other conservation measures are more important than we thought, for example, riparian restoration could be very useful in very specific areas. There's no reason we cannot increase riparian restoration. There's nothing sort of physically or biologically limiting that. More broadly, though, in terms of the boundaries or limits on the adaptive management program as a whole, that's dictated more by the regulations. And there is the no surprises assurances that are provided both under the state and the federal law. And those are defined for this plan in terms of the overall budget, the overall dollar amount that BDCP allows, plus the supplemental adaptive management fund that Laura King-Moon mentioned this morning. The ceiling of which has yet to be defined, but once it is defined, that plus the overall budget would define those limits. But within those limits, there's tremendous flexibility, and we acknowledge in the adaptive management program that it's fairly straightforward to shift resources among conservation measures from ones that are less effective to ones that are more effective, or to change through the more formal adaptive management process some of the more fundamental parameters of those conservation measures, like the target acreage or the geographic focus of those conservation measures. So does that answer your question? Okay.
Going back to YOLO, you mentioned that the farming activities out there may constrain water flow in the YOLO bypass within the BDCP plan. Is that still up in the air a little bit? How much water can be allowed to flow through YOLO bypass because of farming constraints?
So there's a YOLO bypass working group, so I think that they're continuing to work through that, but it's my understanding that what's been modeled is kind of a conservative approach, is something that's at this point generally acceptable. I think it'll continue to be refined, and if it changes substantially, we'll incorporate that analysis, but right now we're not reaching into areas that are way outside of where people are comfortable currently, as far as extending way into the spring months, for example.
So I'm looking at my watch because it's now the time where we said we would take a break. But I'm looking at you, Alex, to see, and the panel to see if you feel like you've asked all the questions you would like to ask, or if you'd like to take a quick break and come back and see if you have any additional questions, as this will be your last chance before you go off to deliberate and prepare your initial recommendations. So.
Yeah, I'd suggest we take maybe the break now.
Okay.
And then
certainly
anything else, because we do have a public comment period, right?
That's correct.
So why don't we take that break and then just come back and see if there's anything else people want to look at.
Okay, great. let's take a break. It's almost 2:50 now, so let's come back at 5 after 3 for any last questions for the panel presenter discussion.